Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another Zen podcast. And with me in the physical studio today, not the virtual studio, I've got three guests to talk about SD-WAN. And the theme of the subject today is going to be very much about SD-WAN applied. We're talking about SD-WAN in practice. And to help us with that, we've got a special guest today. So I'd like to introduce Steve Barnett from SIG. Hello, Steve.
Hi there.
Good to meet you, and I'm glad you've made it because we've had some weather issues today, but it's staying dry. So I'm glad you've made it. And we've also got two key members of the Zen team. So we've got Enzo Romano. Hello, Enzo.
Hi, Stu.
Good afternoon to you, and Andy Dickinson. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Stu.
Brilliant. We'll have some introductions. Just tell us a little bit about what you do and what you're going to bring to today's conversation. Might be a good angle to start. Steve, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your role at SIG?
So I'm Steve Barnett. I'm the Networks and Communications Architect for SIG PLC in the UK. I've been with the company a long time now, over 11 years. Always had a networking background, right from university. So I'm quite long-standing in that area. And I've been working with Zen for the last couple of years.
Fantastic. And it's great to get your insight because this is one of the key parts of this conversation is how this is working in the real world. Enzo?
Yeah, thanks, Stu. So, I'm Enzo Romano. I'm one of the Senior Business Development Managers at Zen. It's the second podcast I've had the pleasure of doing with your good selves. Been with the organisation now coming up to 19 years, so a long time. And my role is very much kind of funneled into networks as an area of expertise, especially over the last kind of 3 to 4 years. And as you'd imagine, as the kind of commercial lead, if you will, for SD-WAN and complex networks, it's very much kind of interacting with people like Steve at SIG and kind of helping these enterprise organisations navigate that network modernisation journey, hopefully try and identify a good fit, just support them end to end, really.
Fantastic. Thanks, Enzo. Andy?
So I work in service development. I'm a technical architect. I've been at Zen for 13 years, and I've been a network engineer for 20 plus years prior to that. So I've been doing a lot of networking in my life. Recently, I've been heavily involved with the design and development of SD-WAN as a product and service at Zen.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andy. I think just from a Zen point of view, we're probably getting on 50 years of lived experience working at Zen. If I rope Sam into that conversation, we've got over half a century. So I keep rambling on about this every time I have a conversation with anyone because it's kind of amazing. Let's get started. I'm keen to know a little bit about who SIG are, Steve, and what you're about as an organisation. Can you give our audience a bit of an overview of your business?
Yeah, because unless you work in construction, we're probably not considered a household name. I think that's fair to say. But the official line is we're a leading pan-European supplier of specialist construction products. So that's in the insulation, interiors, roofing, and exteriors areas, plus some specialist functions. We have a manufacturing business. We've even got a slate man in Spain in our group. We've got about 450 branches across Europe. For myself in the UK, we have about 180 branches. Turnover is about 1.2 billion in the UK and about 2.8 as a group. So a reasonable sized organisation. Existed since the 50s. Origin in Sheffield. That's where our head office is to this day. It's an interesting organisation, I think, in terms of we're a distributed business across the UK.
Yeah, and quite long lived. I mean, from the 1950s, that's quite good going.
Yeah, grew by acquisition over the years, obviously, from within the UK and then into Europe and beyond in the past as well. We have a federated model, so each country in Europe is kind of its own independent business into a PLC board. And obviously I'm responsible for the UK, and I have some elements of my role which cover the group functions. When you get to things like cloud networking, cloud security, they're generally applied at a group level rather than individual country levels. But when we talk about things like the WAN, that's a per country choice. Yeah.
Interesting. And it's interesting as well to think about the scale of that, because you've got both a European operation, so from an IT perspective and a governance perspective, you've got that to consider, and also you've got quite a big footprint in terms of branches in the UK. And what kind of role has technology played in the business since you've been there? Has it changed, and if so, how?
I mean, the nature of the business obviously is an area where we're not often an early adopter. I think it's safe to say, the construction industry as a whole, I think, has had a job in recent years in advancing its use of IT, becoming more modernised. And SIG obviously, very much at the forefront of that. We're always looking at, investing in IT to improve the customer service, improve the experience for our employees. And we in infrastructure, we like to think we're quite proactive in that space. We're always looking at what's next. We always have an eye on the roadmap. We are a cloud-first organisation now from an infrastructure architecture perspective, and obviously, SD-WAN was obviously of interest to us.
Interesting, and of course that leads me on to the next question: is how that came into being for you guys? Because I remember originally we bumped into each other at a Cisco Live event. Andy, what year was that? Do you remember?
I want to say 2016. Was it around then?
I think possibly 2018, 19. I'm going to say. Memory struggling there, but yeah, it was in that kind of era. Yeah.
A few years ago. And I'm thinking back to then, Steve. Was SD-WAN something that you were thinking of then? How did you come across the technology?
It's quite interesting because, again, I think we always have quite a forward-thinking approach to these things. We're always watching the market. We're paying attention to industry trends, so we're generally aware of new technologies, even if we're not yet in the kind of deployment or piloting phase. So we were aware of the trends around the industry from podcasts and industry news. But we'd actually deployed a form of SD-WAN back in 2017, 2018, around the point I mentioned that we have a group of independent wide area networks, and we needed to join them together to start taking advantage of Azure and some central data sharing functions. So we actually deployed what I would consider quite a bespoke white glove SD-WAN solution that wouldn't really be appropriate at a branch level, but it just gave us an ability to deploy networking across the SIG group whilst being independent of the local networks.
Yep.
So we were the glue, if you will. So although it was quite niche and not particularly, again, a widespread vendor, it gave us knowledge, it gave us experience, working with our European colleagues to integrate the networks. It then remained at that scale. It didn't progress, so it wasn't really appropriate. But it meant we at least were in the game. We had knowledge, we had some experience, but very limited. And, from that point on, obviously myself as an architect was very keen to move forward with it as our future architecture, as it was clearly the way the industry was moving. It clearly solved major architectural challenges. Yeah. We were kind of chomping at the bit to move on to a real UK SD-WAN deployment from that point on.
Yeah, interesting, because it sounds like the start point seems to be the spine. So you're effectively attaching independent networks.
Yep.
And I guess the conventional technologies at the time would have dictated a different approach. So what led you to pursue SD-WAN in the first instance?
Oh, I mean, we had, I think, very mainstream challenges for a kind of a reasonably sized organisation in that era. So we were still running classic MPLS with a UK partner. We had challenges around, bandwidth at the branch level in terms of, we had a lot of ADSL still in place. It was maybe costly to upgrade those services to higher rates due to contractual challenges. And often in the UK, people don't consider the move to SD-WAN maybe a cost-saving situation, but it depends on your circumstances.
Yeah.
We didn't have the best contract in place at that time. We still had clearly a central internet breakout. That bottleneck, again, it's the classic SD-WAN story, but it was a real-life issue for us. We had incidents during football tournaments, during, company, all hands meetings where we would max out our central bandwidth. And it's almost the textbook use case for SD-WAN, isn't it, to move to that local breakout. But for us, it was almost the number one driving force behind it. But then some of the ancillary benefits that we identified in the SD-WAN architecture around improved security at the edge. We weren't really on top of our firmware updates on our branch routers, because when you had 360 classic branch routers independently managed, it was a challenge to have those upgraded in a timely fashion if we'd had a vulnerability. So that kind of combination of of challenges was not something we were going to solve with just throwing more circuits at MPLS, in our opinion.
It's interesting because it feels like there's almost a scorecard of those types of, I don't want to call them classic SD-WAN benefits, but we've talked about centralized breakout, bottleneck there. We talked about legacy circuits in the access network. We talked about Azure, so we talked about cloud integration. There's a number of things kind of that we kind of hear about in terms of the literature, in terms of what, I mean, from your point of view, Andy, Enzo, what's your perspective in terms of those things? Because I guess our initial conversations with SIG were around those challenges that were affecting you. Is there a pattern in terms of other customers we've looked at, Enzo?
Yeah, I think, like you say, what Steve outlined there kind of addresses some of the main challenges that you'd expect. And it's interesting you made the point, Steve, around SD-WAN being viewed as a cost-saving measure for most organisations, and actually in the UK it's not. Typically, it tends to be, if you look at it from a like-for-like perspective, it's more of an investment to move to SD-WAN over traditional MPLS. But it is unique to everyone's circumstance. And like you say, if you have a legacy contract with legacy links, then there's the opportunity to get the best of both worlds, i.e. commercial value and improved technical value as well over what you're actually moving into. But it definitely marries up, to answer your question, Stu, it definitely marries up with what we see with other organisations, i.e. cloud adoption tends to be the main thing, driving a cloud-first network. It makes sense to go in that direction because application performance becomes ever more important. The ability to optimise bandwidth as well, especially at poor performing sites, so the ability to run active links, which can be quite problematic with an MPLS, where it tends to be more of an active-passive type of configuration. So flexibility is key, and also the ability to run connectivity with third parties and bring those into the network. And it all comes under that managed service banner as well. So although it's great for most of that connectivity to come through a service provider like Zen, the flexibility to go kind of almost off net, if you will, and procure another circuit is really advantageous.
Yeah, no, that's a good summation, Enzo. I think that flexibility of having choices you can make about circuits, when we're seeing it, some of our other customers, I've heard about Starlink being used. I always get excited about that because it's space stuff, right? But I hear about that happening more and more. There's just more flexibility, more versatility there. And Andy, from your perspective, I know you've worked very closely with Steve on the implementation. Those patterns, again, are there similarities? I mean, the cloud adoption, the Azure integration, I know that's specific to an SIG use case here. Is that something you're seeing with other customers too?
Yeah, absolutely. Because traditionally, most customers had a central focal point for where the business applications lived. That's changed completely now. So the applications live anywhere and everywhere. And then we need to be able to facilitate that and make it adaptable and flexible for the customers to be able to leverage whatever connectivity they've got and get the same experience. And with SD-WAN, it gives you that ability. So we can use circuits provided by Zen, or we can use the connectivity the customer's already got until they buy circuits from Zen, obviously. But we can be flexible in that way.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are, and it's reassuring as well that what we talk about in the marketing world is kind of aligning with what customers need. Because the next question is, or what we'll come on to, is that working out in practice? And that's what I'm keen to try and find out about a bit more. I suppose the next question following on from that, Steve, is in order to get there, I mean, obviously from a Zen point of view, we're in the business of providing these solutions, right? So we're often on the receiving end of RFIs and RFPs and things like this. And it would be really interesting to share a little bit of insight from the customer point of view about your thought process there. So when you're looking for a supplier and a technology, what are those key things that matter to you? And what did you learn from that process? Is it a process within SIG that's well formulated and it's a case of running it? Or with SD-WAN, did you have to think a little differently about how you were going to approach it?
I mean, obviously, company our size, we do run RFPs fairly regularly, so that there's a level of kind of familiarity. But obviously, you generally run an RFP for a certain technology once. Ironically, we kind of cheated a little bit, and I actually managed to run it twice because we had one that was focused in France and Germany, and we ran that, and then it kind of went in a different direction. But it meant when we came to the UK, we had somewhat of a run book to deploy. Now, we built that up not solely by ourselves. I mean, I think that's a really, really large undertaking. So we absolutely took external advice. We had some analysts, time available to us. We brought on a project manager initially who was familiar with running RFPs, and we kind of, adjusted it to suit SIG. We didn't take it off the shelf. Yeah. But it maybe saved a lot of the legwork around, basic requirements, things that you shouldn't forget to ask, in terms of capabilities or service provider, resources, etc. So we kind of used that kind of initial building block. We took a lot of knowledge from people in the industry that we'd spoken to, like yourselves, Cisco Live. The vendors themselves, if you ask questions, you're not committing to them at that point. It's all knowledge, it's all information. You can take it on board. Again, that helps build up a picture in your mind of what your priorities are and that you need to focus on during the RFP process. Again, I think the main thing is just reach out there, be open-minded about who you speak to. We spoke to both service providers, independent organizations who maybe do kind of WAN sourcing, vendors themselves asking for their advice. We were very clear that the RFP would be technology agnostic, so we did not specify a solution. Okay. We went out with a set of requirements and said, you let us know what you think matches SIG best. Yeah, I think that was important. Don't create too much of a filter.
Was that tricky, Steve? Given that. I know we work together quite closely now, but you're a technology guy. Is it hard to keep that to one side? Did you have something that was a favorite, or do you have people? How did you deal with that kind of bias, or was it really a problem?
Well, it's quite funny because the first thing to obviously bear in mind is that the industry changes over time. Like I say, we in effect ran 2 RFPs, and the first time round, what we ended up selecting wasn't actually offered by any of the partners in that pan-European scope, which I found interesting. It showed you that even a year, 18 months time, the development, maybe a change in commercial model can make a product, become available to you that wasn't available before or wasn't a realistic choice before. So that's always interesting. Yeah, obviously we all have our kind of history with vendors. We all have our impressions. You have to do your best, I think, to be, honest and remain agnostic. Let the facts lead the discussion. We had a very clear RFP kind of capabilities matrix and requirements model. We had a pricing model that we built for people to populate, which again maintains the honesty. And we had a scoring matrix for the technical capabilities that myself, our senior network engineer, and our head of infrastructure would all look at independently and come to that kind of, aligned view on, do we agree on these solutions?
Yeah, it sounds like a good approach because it gives you quite a broad view of concerns in the organization.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I would call out is you take your time over it. This isn't something you rush into. These are always going to be long-term commercial relationships, hopefully, partnerships even. There's obviously investment up front. You don't want to act in haste, repent at leisure. But also I think it allows you to do things like, I described it as looking under the hood. So I did things like assess, and by going to an industry event, I kind of had some of these ideas planted in my head, was looking at like the Peering DB website and assessing some of the offers, internet peering, bandwidth. It's like, okay, if you're going to offer us X amount of bandwidth to consume across all the SIG branches, how much peering bandwidth have you got available? What ratio are we running at? And that was interesting. That was really enlightening. Some very large organizations had less bandwidth than I might have expected. And some smaller organizations, they were maybe offering us an aggregate, maybe 50-something gigabits of bandwidth if you totaled up all the branches. And they maybe didn't have much more than that themselves at the internet peering level to share amongst all their customers. And I found that very enlightening, and it gives you some real kind of points of difference between different organizations, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think just doing a little bit of independent analysis, almost like a due diligence around the the potential partner, that's an important thing to consider, definitely. And that process, that RFP process, when it came to Zen's involvement in that and going through that discussion, what were the kind of key talking point? What were the key concerns, Steve, that you were looking to get out of the projects? If you could distill it down into a handful of things you wanted SD-WAN to deliver for you as a business.
I mean, we pitched the RFP as having kind of three almost like workstream silos, whatever you want to call them. And obviously that was like technical, service, and commercial. It's like three legs almost of a stool. They all need to work out for you. And if you have a shortfall in any of those areas, it's not really viable. If you're going to have a long-term relationship, all those three things need to be in alignment with our requirements. So obviously from the technical perspective, as you've mentioned before, we were clearly looking for a cloud-based architecture. Again, we wanted to be transport agnostic, although we were expecting to be internet only. We wanted to be able to, like Enzo mentioned before, consume any form of internet, although the expectation was the partner would very much lead with an underlay offer. But we have different situations, as you mentioned. We're using Starlink at a site at the minute. We've got managed service offices. We're obviously in Hull. Everyone knows you have to use a local supplier there. So being flexible and being able to consume all of those services was important to us. We defined a minimum bandwidth per user that meant we could be agnostic about what services you provided to us whilst maintaining a level of service. Things like Azure, we use Zscaler. Integrations with those services are important. Being able to deploy some form of edge security to improve our kind of security posture at the branch was important for us. So I say we laid those requirements out. Managed service, having that clarity around service levels, what's in scope. It's a different architecture to what people might have been used to with classic MPLS. Being clear on that, just made sure that we could compare the different offers on a level playing field. And obviously the commercials then are their own story, because you've got that mix of hardware investment, licensing. Different vendors have very different licensing models. You might have different tiers that different partners might believe you can fit into. And obviously the underlay pricing is relevant as well. So put those all together and you've got quite a job to assess.
Yeah, it does. It is quite a task. And I guess it's a key one to get right, because it is an investment of money, but there's a significant investment in time. And I guess that leads us on to getting past that process. So once you've chosen the supplier, which, we're talking about the Zen relationship now, moving into projects, the realization, I guess, Stephen, once things start to get implemented, is first question there, it relates to your relationship with the technology and how it differs with that of MPLS. So how hands-on were you before with the technology, before SD-WAN? And what were your expectations about your involvement with it now? Is it the kind of service where you're expecting to give the keys to Zen or another supplier and say, go do it for me? Or were you expecting something more? And a slightly related question is what you expected to get out in terms of information. Because one of the big things that SD-WAN is positioned as providing is that visibility and control side of things.
Yeah.
Was there anything there going into this and starting to see it unfold in a project that changed your expectations of that?
One thing to call out is that we didn't run maybe a proof of concept before we made the RFP decision. It was very much, off-plan choice, so to speak. So there was an element of learning as we went along, and obviously worked with Andy and the team on an LLD, which is obviously still theoretical at that point. But you start getting into the mindset and you start getting demonstrations of user interface, the capabilities as they are actually deployed, as opposed to on the marketing materials and on the kind of the tactical sessions at Cisco Live that you hear about and you learn about, and you see an architecture on a PowerPoint slide. It's different when you get into the real world and understand how it actually works. Going back to your first question, our MPLS arrangement was what I consider to be pretty conventional in that it was totally locked down. Our classic MPLS network was read-only for ourselves at the routers. We had discussions during the RFP about how that works in the SD-WAN world, and is it more flexible? And the answer is it can be eventually. But realistically, we were never going to do that on day one. We have to skill up ourselves internally, increase our knowledge and awareness. So from day one, it was clear that we are reliant on yourself. We're reliant on your expertise. We're reliant on your knowledge of other deployments. We weren't your first SD-WAN deployment, which obviously is good for us because we take advantage of that learning. So that was, a key thing is that we are still reliant on you, but we obviously enjoy the full access. We learn by, viewing configurations, viewing policies. When we've asked for a change to be made, we can then view, okay, this is what the guys did to make it happen. And that helps us learn as we go along.
Yeah.
But we're not there yet in terms of co-management. That's coming. I know there's some Cisco feature set work on role-based access control that's required. And frankly, we need to up our skill levels as well before we can carry out some defined changes. And even then, I think it'd be very clearly delineated what is a customer possible change and what is realistically a service request into Zen. And we're very, very comfortable with that model. I think that works well for us when we get there.
And I think that there has been some improvements as well in terms of your capabilities over MPLS, because I think you've got some capabilities to do things, some diagnostics, troubleshooting from within the overlay itself. So you get more visibility and I get a bit more insight into the way that your network's operating.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as I say, we had the read-only visibility of MPLS routers, but as we know, fairly simple, classic MPLS edge router. You're looking at the route table, basic stuff. We've definitely got enhanced visibility from SD-WAN. I'm sure we'll talk about it more later in terms of what that gives us in terms of business outcomes. But just on a technical level, it's fantastic to have greater visibility of flows. Some of the tracing that's possible on the SD-WAN platform is really helpful with troubleshooting, understanding what policies are applying or why not. So yeah, even as there's relative, newbies to the SD-WAN technology, it's still a big uplift in capability. Yeah,
definitely. And I'd be doing a disservice not to ask what were those decision criteria? Why did you choose Zen, Steve, and why did you choose Cisco?
You had the best offer. You won on the scoring. No, obviously, as I said, those three areas you had to get a tick in each of them fundamentally. Obviously, some of that requires maybe negotiation sometimes. Some of it requires a kind of bit of iteration on reviewing the offer in terms of the technology stack. I think we tweaked a few things. Some of it was maybe us asking for an enhancement. Maybe moving the hardware per level. Because something I didn't mention is that we brought in Thousand Eyes into the proposal, which was, I think, something we brought on as a request because we saw it as viable, and I was extremely interested in that. I'd had a little interaction with Thousand Eyes before they were acquired with Cisco, and I was very impressed with it. So obviously moving to internet-only SD-WAN, I think that visibility for us was critical. I mean, you get an enormous amount of visibility from the SD-WAN platform itself and fantastic knowledge about flows, as I mentioned, but I think that Thousand Eyes piece was a real kind of, game changer for us, I think. So that was interesting to be able to bring that in. And the fact that you guys were flexible to be able to do that. I also think the relationship piece, speaking non-technically for a second, we had a face-to-face RFP session that you attended, and Martin, your MD, attended. And that really meant something to us. We had an alternative shortlisted bidder, and they had a slide that just had an exec's face on it that said, "I'm excited to work with SIG." If you're not in the room, I'm not sure how excited you are. So, stuff like that, I think that the sort of personal relationships that we built during the RFP, it did mean something. It did have an effect. Yeah. There was trust. There was kind of confidence there. As I say, we signed off the RFP purely on a kind of a paper basis. It was on the basis of your proposal and the discussions. There was no proof of concept. There was no trial period. We committed on a level of trust, I suppose, but because it worked for us, as I say, on the kind of technical service and commercial levels.
I think just one thing to add as well from someone who's kind of manages these processes end to end, it came across really how SIG were very focused on technology as well as the kind of supply fit. They were both equally important, but there was a definite kind of focus on finding the right kind of technical platform fit to deliver the outcomes that you were looking for. And then once you kind of almost settled on that, then finding the right supplier became a really important piece for you as well. And yeah, it kind of came through with the fact you've done all the research up front. We always talk about how we run our network in an uncontended fashion, build capacity ahead of demand. It was so refreshing to have someone such as yourself already kind of done that research and come to us and said, I know. You know, it's kind of it's good. It was really refreshing approach. And you know, some organisations you speak to and they're not that bothered about the technology. They're almost kind of, you just solve our problems and we're not bothered how you go about it, because they don't necessarily have that technical fit, and that's fine. You know, if they don't have that knowledge, you know, that's where they lean on you as a partner even more heavily to make the right decision and guide them through delivering the right solution. But obviously, you came at it from you know, you had that level of knowledge as a business and you'd done that research. So there's different approaches, isn't there? Is what we're trying to say. It's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, that's it. You're right, Enzo. And I think that's where Zen can offer something, because it sounds a bit trite, but it's true. It's a relationship driven business, but it's one that's built on that expertise and that trust, because we're trying to do the right thing fundamentally. I guess looking at the project, this is the interesting stuff. Getting into what happened. So when we start getting into the design and the build, and I suppose the first question there, I mean, one thing that strikes me actually, Steve, and this is getting on, knowing you a lot as well, Andy, in the project, is there's a lot of collaboration. So this doesn't feel like a technology that's just done to you. I mean, I suppose it could be done that way. You could just move in your entirety and just, but it feels like something that a customer needs to commit to and get involved in. Is that an aspect of a technology, or is it more to do with the relationship between the two businesses?
I think it's massively helpful if the customer understands their own requirements and network and the way that their applications work, which in Steve's case, he absolutely did. So he could tell us exactly how their network performed and what they wanted to see and which applications were most important to them. So that was much easier. So often for other customers, you've got to tease that out, and it's a much more lengthy conversation to do that. But it has to have that level of engagement with the customer and the end users to get that information from them. So what I'm saying is it was slightly easier with Steve because he already had that information to hand.
Yeah, definitely. From your point of view, Steve, did that collaboration go as you expected? I mean, did you have to lean more into the technical side or not? Or did it give you any surprises, I guess, compared to what you've experienced with MPLS, the level of commitment, the level of involvement that you needed to do?
I think because we'd had that background of, tracking industry, having some limited real-life SD-WAN experience, even though clearly we didn't have any Cisco SD-WAN direct experience. We dodged the whole IWAN era. We kind of came clean in.
Lucky escape.
Into
Edit that out. I don't want to upset anyone at Cisco.
And as I said, previous RFPs, we'd kind of had visibility of the Viptela products, but when we came around this time, it was very clearly, front and center for various bidders, not just Zen. And it was very convincing at that point. I think it had reached a maturity level that it was convincing to me as a technologist to trust that it could deliver what it said it could. So in terms of surprises, I would say not so much surprises, maybe pleasant surprise that it does deliver what it promises. Obviously, there's a lot of complexity. It's not always absolutely straight away it works exactly as you hope or expect. There's clearly refinement, tuning needed. As I say, you need to have experts involved. This isn't something that you DIY, in my opinion, unless you're a very large organization with, dozens or hundreds of network engineers who can spend a multi-year, period building up their skill set before they go live. I think realistically, we leaned on, obviously, the Zen team, learned a lot about what was possible. Often I'd be asking questions of, well, how do we do this? Like, I would maybe know how I might have done it before, but that's not relevant anymore. There's a new paradigm, there's a new way of working. So we've gained a lot, and we're still on that journey. Obviously, I still, learn things most weeks from the guys about, what is and isn't possible.
Yeah, I think it's the same for us. We learn a lot as well. We all learn a lot about the way businesses use the systems as well. So we tailor what we do as standard based on what our experience with real life traffic and data and the way we treat that. So I think there's a learning in both directions.
Yeah, definitely. And one question relating to this, Steve, is the process of migration, because I know that maybe people listening to this have this concern about disruption. So you're moving from a a legacy network that is pretty. It's pretty plain, it's pretty well understood, but it's reliable. And now you're moving into this new era.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about how that worked for you, because I mean, we talked about prior to starting whether we were involved in pilots and evaluations and this kind of thing, and how to minimize disruption. So how was that experience for you, that process of moving from your old environment to the new one?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it was, as ever, with things in technology, good planning. We'd had the discussions, we'd had an LLD drawn up. We were on the same page in terms of how we achieve the migration. As ever, you need that interaction, you need that interconnect between the old and the new, and we did it at our data centers. So that was like absolute step one was we needed SD-WAN connectivity into our data centers so we could interoperate with the legacy MPLS network. That was obviously the very first kind of major gateway for us to get through. And after that, we were kind of lucky in that we didn't have so many hard deadlines, so we had the kind of the freedom to deploy SD-WAN to a greenfield site. There was a new site that was opening up, so we had a bit of liberal timelines there that we could deploy the SD-WAN, test it out, kind of not quite at leisure, but without the pressure of it, having to work during a cutover window straight away. So that was very helpful. I think that kind of acted as almost a bit of a proof of concept, as we went to a degree. And after that, it was like iteration, isn't it? You're constantly iterating your design. The LLD was almost a living creature for a long time because it's a big beast. There's a lot to cover. Like Andy said, so many applications we had to work out, how they should be treated. Yep. But the actual migration itself, I would say, once you have that basic routing design understood and proven, it does become, fingers crossed, and touch wood, kind of quite a repetitive process. You get into that kind of routine of migrating sites. You understand what your test plan is. You maybe, you don't want to be migrating your first site at 12 o'clock during the working day. I mean, that's goes back to the planning point. But other than that, no, I was pretty comfortable with the whole process. And like I say, we were lucky that we had a period of months where we could deploy some trial sites without, any major concern of, we can regress this site. You can go back to the MPLS. Yep. There's no harm done. We learn the lesson. If there was a failed migration for whatever reason, technical or non-technical causes, happen. So that definitely helped us. Yeah.
Yeah, some good threads that I think are familiar to past projects, but you can't escape good planning and contingency. As you say, if the existing network's available and you've got an ability to plan and prioritize and protect those high value sites until you're more mature in the deployment cycle, then that's going to be a win for sure. And I guess that leads us on to a discussion about the benefits that start to emerge, Steve. I want to come back for a second to this question of self-management, because one of the things, in fact, go all the way back to the RFI, if you're looking at SD-WAN as a technology, because there are different vendors offering different things. And Cisco SD-WAN is an enterprise product.
Yeah.
It's capable of deploying to multinational businesses globally. And with that comes a degree of complexity. There are other technologies that are aimed more at the self-serve DIY market. I think we know enough about your organization to recognize that Cisco SD-WAN fits really well. Andy, I suppose the question for you is, how complex is SD-WAN? Or is it a case of it's made to measure according to your requirements if you're picking a vendor, or indeed if you're using Cisco SD-WAN? Is it something that's self-drivable?
I think it's possible to self-drive it within some constraints. So if you've got a quite simple infrastructure, some basic requirements, then yeah, we can probably do it as a cookie cutter approach. And I think that's definitely possible. But I think the benefits of something like Viptela is the levels of complexity you can get into and the customization that you can do and the way that you can treat traffic specifically. And some of the innovations that we're able to do, and we're working on some at the moment for SIG, so that we can control the amount of bandwidth being used on a site, and that type of capability isn't going to be possible on a basic configuration or a basic deployment. You need some higher tier vendor or service like Viptela to be able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's to Enzo's point earlier about having that benefit of active.
Yeah.
So, but you're going down to the level of a flow, and that's the real power of this. But of course, the most you can optimize that will depend on that investment, which depends on how much you could see into the network and talk to your users, understand your applications and their behaviors. What benefits have you started to see emerging, Steve, or is it a little too early in terms of, and I guess there's two ways of looking at this. We'll come back to the RFI, actually. If you go back to the requirements, the RFP, if you go back to the requirements and your stakeholders, where do you think your stakeholders are at the moment in those key groups in terms of how they regard the project and the technology a few months down the line?
I mean, thankfully, very successfully, I think is how they regard it. I think, as per the comments about migration, I mean, I think fundamentally we didn't really, although we had to regress some sites and then, assess issues and then come back again, fundamentally, we didn't cause any business impact from the migrations, really, beyond what we pitched, So that was the main thing. There were no disasters, there weren't any major outages that could be put upon the SD-WAN migration project. And that's obviously number one job, don't break what's already working. Service is obviously considered to be of a very high standard, and there's two elements to that. Obviously, there's the technology, and then there's the Zen day-to-day managed service. Both got a really good reputation within our business, in my opinion. Doesn't mean there haven't been issues. We'll mention it later on that there's, you deploy technology, you're going to hit odd issues, bugs, lessons to be learned. But nothing has not been as advertised at a fundamental level. Like I say, so as we're talking about application awareness, the fact that we can take advantage of that, if we're talking about benefits, that is light years away from where we were on MPLS and Central Breakout. Bandwidth. The increase in our bandwidth is quite incredible when you look at it. I used to have like a small, relatively small internet breakout in the core, which was scalable to a degree, but it was relatively expensive. We've now put a tremendous amount of bandwidth at a branch level, local breakout policies, leveraging things like our Zscaler, Office 365. We've now just signed a deal to move to a UCaaS platform. So like I say, so much of our traffic is now local breakout focused. The ability to, fulfill that and utilize both those circuits at the site, for me, has been like the number one success story. It's really changed the user experience for our branch staff. And for years, it's been, people want more bandwidth. It's like the number one story for business, applications. So to be able to deliver that is fantastic. But things like the security elements have been really helpful. We have we used to have a risk around lateral movement across our network because there wasn't a firewall in place between any of our branches. We've now got policies in place that massively restrict that, and hopefully in future we can trim that down even further as we move to yet more cloud-based applications. And basically at that point, 90+% of your traffic is out to the internet, and there's maybe a percentage going to Azure. So that's important. The visibility, I know we've mentioned it before, but again, it simply didn't exist before, not at the flow level, not at the application level. You're always playing catch up, I think, with a classic MPLS network in terms of your network visibility. We've got the old NetFlow and SMP, but it always felt like a losing battle, whereas in the SD-WAN world, it's there natively. I know we've got some enhancements as well with some of the tool sets, but fundamentally it's built to provide you visibility, which is, fantastic, both on a day-to-day basis, being aware of the trends, being aware of our status of the network, the health of the network, but especially when you get into a troubleshooting scenario, it's, so much easier to deal with.
Just to jump in on that point about visibility, and it might be too early for you to give a view on this, but I know certain organisations, because it is such a game changer within SD-WAN to have that application visibility and trends in terms of bandwidth within specific applications, it might involve wider stakeholders, because what you can basically do with that knowledge is if a business has invested heavily in a particular application and it's not being used as extensively, as you might think, that can prompt the wider stakeholders to think, okay, why is that not being used? Address it. Or if there are peaks at particular times, what's prompting people to use it at that time and not at other times? So I think there's wider benefits beyond the technical, isn't there? Where you could use that. It's the classic data-driven decision making, isn't it? So that information can feed into CFOs, other chief operating officers that might think, actually, I can use that to make wider decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting use case, isn't it? Like I say, it's almost like outside of the ordinary, but I would agree is that it's available and it wasn't before.
Yeah.
So that's the main thing, is that we can look into, is that useful information. I think the main thing, as to your point around application, importance, is the ability to rapidly and at scale increase the importance of an application in terms of quality of service, quality of experience, policy. That would have been quite an onerous job on a classic MPLS network. I think now, I won't put timescales on it, but very quickly we could say, oh, actually, there's an event happening or there's a new application emerging that we need to deploy in days or weeks, and we can then prioritize that traffic on the network at all branches with one policy change, which just simply wasn't possible before. I think that's my main sort of advantage.
Yeah, exactly. How many times have we heard of our customers with an MPLS network having a site that's saturated, and it's because there's a Windows update going on, and people are scratching their heads there. How you control that? How do you change that? And we can do that with tools like SD-WAN. So it is interesting.
Yeah, it comes right the way back to that original discussion around the marketing collateral. For early SD-WAN was always about business intent. So this is communicating with those groups that are non-technical, and it's the information space that this technology makes available, but also just the reliability that it provides as well, I think, and the ability to use those different services, the different access services. It's great to hear it's having those dividends, Steve. That's really the crux of this discussion. I just wanted to move into a bit of a wrap up. So I wanted to try and get a bit of insight into how it's aligning with the strategy for SIG, Steve, whether you see it's fitting in there. And then I thought it would be good to just sum up with a couple of tips. So I'm going to go around the table, and if anyone's listening and wants to get onto the SD-WAN train, is any advice that we can pass along if you're contemplating embarking, on this journey. But the strategy question. So your IT strategy as an organization, Steve, how does SD-WAN fit in with it? And is it fulfilling what's needed there?
Yeah. Oh, it's absolutely an enabler. So from an IT strategy perspective, clearly we are cloud first now. It's an ongoing process. We had an Azure migration, various applications moving to both SaaS and, PaaS models, some hosted by ourselves in Azure, others hosted by other partners. So the agility that the SD-WAN gives us is fantastic. We've deployed environments using the Catalyst 8000V into a completely greenfield location with a partner cloud hosting. So they might be hosting the application in AWS or another Azure tenant. In the past, that had been quite a clunky, manual IPsec VPN conversation. Now it's a case of, well, can we deploy our SD-WAN appliances into your tenant and reach out and natively, integrate them into our network? That's, again, fantastic benefit, and really aligns the ability for applications to live anywhere with our network capability, that we can move that policy, with the application. So the security policy, the quality of experience policies, we are kind of agnostic about where it lies. It can be in Azure, it can be on the internet, it can be in another hosting partner's environment, physical or virtual, and we can deploy the SD-WAN to them. I think that's massive for me as an architect to be able to offer that. It really enhances our capabilities. In terms of wider strategy, obviously, as a business, one of SRG's key strategy planks is improving customer service. Us improving the reliability and the speed of access for all of these various cloud applications directly supports that. You don't want your customers waiting at one of our tray counters because the system is lagging or because of latency or limited bandwidth. So there is, it sounds, I'm a technical person, so I'm obviously going to believe in technology. I'm going to enjoy deploying it. I'm going to think it's the right thing to do. But there is an absolute direct link between a genuine business experience, business outcome, and the technology in my mind.
Definitely. I think in the technical realm, we see that with this change in terms of how we measure things. So it's increasingly about user experience and less about technology metrics. We traditionally talk about packet loss, jitter, latency, this kind of thing. I think it's that language and even the technology that underpins it is kind of changing to reflect that. And I wanted to pick up briefly on, because we did mention there are some wrinkles, and I don't want anyone to think I'm glossing over that on this call, right? Because inevitably there are going to be challenges with technology like this. What are the things you've seen, and how have we dealt with them?
I mean, obviously, there's been some things where we've had to learn about maybe some of the constraints of the platform. There's maybe some areas where, we can't wave a magic wand and do everything we want to. So you have to understand how you best overcome those challenges. And for us, it's generally there's been a compromise which is fair and reasonable, and we still achieve our goals. It's just about working out what the right design choices are to do what you want to do whilst maintaining the supportability of the design and of the product set. And hey, we've had a few attack cases open. There's been a couple of bugs, but that's natural. Nobody has ever got through a technology deployment without some form of patch or firmware update being required. But again, when that's been required, well, we can deploy firmware updates at scale now quite easily. So it's not the massive task it might have been in the past to resolve.
Yeah. It's a fair comment, Andy. There's quite a lot of use of templates and automation that underpins this, right? So we can deal with some of these things more effectively.
Yeah, standardization is really key to it. And the more standardization you get, the easier it is to manage and apply those changes at scale. I think one thing I'd say to everybody who's thinking about adopting SD-WAN is it's not magic. You have to be prepared to engage in it. So it's been refreshing having a customer that knows what they want and be prepared to spend the time with you to work through these problems. If you just want to throw something over the fence and say, make it all work, then the chances are it's not going to be perfect for you. When you get that deployment, it's not going to do. It doesn't know what you're thinking, so it's not going to be able to provide the performance and the requirements that you need for your environment. And in terms of the issues we've seen or any problems we've seen with SD-WAN, as Steve said, a lot of them are teething problems. We've managed to work around them. So an example might be a particular application, the way that it operates. Maybe we weren't expecting the application to behave in that way, and it needs a particular set of parameters for it to work optimally. And things like that can cause really weird problems which don't manifest themselves straight away. So it might work 75% of the time absolutely perfectly, then occasionally you'll get a weird issue. Yeah. So things like that trick you, and it's because of the underlying capabilities of SD-WAN, the fact that it can route traffic over multiple paths, it can trip you up a little bit.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of the challenge that comes with having that granularity of control, right? Is it moves that dial slightly up in terms of the effort needed, and I think that's probably a little bit of advice, Andy. Is you basically, the more you put in, the more you get out. And if you do give it to someone, just say, go do, then you'll get something that works well. But is it going to give you something vastly different, vastly better than MPLS? Well, maybe some things, but you're not going to get the huge benefits unless you're willing to commit the time. I guess in that vein, and in a way of wrapping up what's been a really useful conversation, Steve, Enzo, have you had any tips, any advice to anyone listening in on who wants to get involved in SD-WAN and thinking about taking on the technology?
I think it's picking up on the point you made about the new language. Kind of rewind 5-10 years, MPLS, it was very much a technically driven discussion, kind of measuring bandwidths, packet loss, jitter, the things you've measured. But it's all around now, just defining the business outcomes. For any organisation looking to embark on this kind of modernisation journey, really trying to nail down what the business outcomes are, and then kind of almost reverse engineering from that point is always easier than trying to kind of work down up, because then you, as a service provider who's engaging with that customer, you've got always clear sight of what the objective is within everything that you do, every engagement, and it's something that comes to the fore when we run field trials with customers. Kind of defining the success criteria is really critical, and sometimes we will get success criteria which are quite technical in the way they're defined, and we try and kind of push back and try and kind of keep the customer focused on what the business outcomes are. So I think if for any organisation that's going through this, a focus on that is key. And I think the other thing is also doing that upfront research. because the more research you do up front, it can kind of lead you to a particular platform that might be best suited to you. And then ultimately it saves time down the line, because otherwise you might be speaking to partners who specialize in a particular platform, but that might not be the best fit for your needs. And then it's kind of fitting a square peg into a round hole. So I think focus on business outcomes and upfront research would be the two things for me.
Yeah, excellent advice, Enzo. And it resonates with your point, Steve, about that technology agnostic approach. So, and I guess just to finish with you, Steve, are there any top tips to, and I guess from a customer point of view in particular?
Well, I said technology, I'll just leave it. Be agnostic, be open-minded, don't have preconceived ideas in terms of vendors or solutions, but be quite strong on your requirements. Have real clarity around those requirements. Make sure that, say, they match to your technology and your business outcomes that you're interested in. And then just speak to people, events, partners, vendors, get out there, see who's offering what, and have quite high expectations, I would say. There's a lot of solutions out there. We made a choice with, both vendor and partner, we're very, very happy with. Other people might have different requirements, different situation. They might want something different, but don't accept kind of shortfalls, I think, because I think that the industry's at a point now where it's mature, the technology's matured. You should be able to deliver, your business outcomes. There's probably a good fit for you if you speak to the right people.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot for that. And thanks, guys, for this session. I think it was really useful. We'll put some links as ever in the show notes for further reading and advice. But thank you very much, Steve, for taking the time to come and talk to us.
It was a pleasure.
And hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.